Hello, everyone. Let's make sure we have something. All right. And let me get your chat box up here where it belongs. So this week's video is going to be about LPS corals, but I have some updates to give you first. And I want to make sure we have sound. I'm trying something new today. This is a wireless mic. You have sound. Okay, thank you very much for letting me know. It's like you know what I need. Thank you so much. All right, so LPS corals is the topic. I actually asked you guys for a lot of questions, which were pretty much everything I was going to cover, but I thought, what if someone asked something that was not included in my list? This is a wireless mic. I bought 2 of them. I put a picture up on Instagram of what I ordered. And it allows me to be free. I'm not connected to a wire to the streaming device, which makes me super happy. I'm streaming from my iPhone 10. And what's first is my cleaning magnets. So I've been using this type of cleaning magnet for years. And my tank sitter said, hey, I took one of your magnets off the tank because when I used it, it made a scratching sound. And I'm just like, well, that's weird. And so what had happened was inside this part here, some of my calcified tube worms were growing inside the Velcro. And so I didn't blog about this, which I really should have. I don't know why. I just kind of just was doing it. But I wanted to show you guys the before and after. So first thing I'm going to do here is try to grab a magnet out of here without dropping it. So here is, I can't do it. I'm too short. Spock, don't chew on me. All right, got it. So first of all, this is the underside of the outside magnet. It's kind of a felt. And if you look at the felt, it looks a little white and dirty. And this can actually be replaced. And then this one here is the scrubby part, which is Velcro. And it can be cleaned with a toothbrush from time to time. I like this magnet because it is called the algae float. And when you take it apart, it floats to the surface so you can grab it, assuming you're tall enough. And so here is a dirty one that I haven't replaced the pads on. Then I thought I'd show you, let me move this out of the way so you guys can see the tank. Here is one I just took apart and cleaned. We're going to go through this whole thing again. Maybe I'll get quicker this time. All right, got it. This is the brand new felt. And as you can see, nice and clean, won't leave any smudges. Now, how do you keep the felt clean? Is keep your glass clean before you start doing all the swiping. I'm holding this up here to let it dry off. Now, this is the other scrubby, and you saw the difference. The first one was all filled with crap. This one here is brand new. Now, the way it works to remove these, this one you just peel it off. It wasn't really hard to do. I peeled it. I used rubbing alcohol to clean it, and I adhered the new one. The company actually sells you replacement pads for both halves. And then this one here was a little bit harder. So what I did with this one was I peeled back a little bit, and it had been on my cleaning magnet for probably a year, maybe longer. And so it was really hard to remove. And as I peeled it, I got just enough peeled up to where I could grab needle nose pliers. And then if you can imagine wrapping spaghetti around a fork, I took the pliers and I twisted and twisted, and it just became like a cone. And it peeled this off as an entire piece. And then, of course, I cleaned it again, and I adhered the new one on there. Done. And I was thinking, you know, it's funny. I'm doing this, but... Okay, Spock, you have to move. But I was wondering, how many of you actually replace the pads on your cleaning magnets, or how many of you are just buying a new one, or use the same one forever and don't even really realize what's happening? There's a couple of things you want to be aware of when it comes to using cleaning magnets, and that is, if something gets between here and the glass, it can scratch. And that could be sand. If it's an acrylic tank, it could be an Astorina starfish. I've actually done that before, where I was just cleaning, and a Astorina starfish got in between, and I was working on my acrylic tank, and I just went back and forth. And then I had all these lines because the actual surface of the starfish is like sandpaper, and it scuffed up my tank. And I was so mad at myself for not just knocking that starfish out of my way before I started cleaning. Now, so that is the kind that I've been using for years. Then the nice people at Flipper asked me if I would go ahead and try out their cleaning magnet. So I said, all right, I'll do it. And to be honest, I've only used it a couple times. and I have not learned the art of making it flip. I've read the instructions and I need to practice. So I'm going to be doing a video about this. And I know it's not a brand new product, but it was new to me. I've seen it for a long time. I'm super picky about what touches the glass, and a metal blade always makes me nervous. So they have two different types for the tip. They've got the plastic tip that's supposed to carve off coralline and so forth, and then they got the metal tip. And I wanted to mention that someone told me, and I don't know if it's true, so feel free in the comments to let me know, as well as in the chat. When they bought replacement blades, the replacements weren't as sharp as the original. And I thought that's interesting. So what's your response, or how have you felt about it? You know, have you bought replacements, and how did it work out for you? I'd like to know. Now, this side here is a scrubby, but it's kind of it's not Velcro like the other one is. This one seems to be more of a mesh material. And then the other side would just work like this and scrape the glass, and these little ball bearing type wheels or nubs rub on the glass. And I have a couple of scratches on my glass, but I don't know where they came from, and I don't know if it was this. I don't know if it was my cleaning magnet with the little tube worms inside. I'm not sure, but I'll tell you this. The area at the end of my tank is black acrylic, and it's really hard to clean off, and yet I love to clean it. Every couple of months I go in there and I take a credit card and I scrape off everything. I use this thing instead, and it took off all the coralline, all the algae, and it came out really nice. So I'm going to drag you over there and show you the difference. So I'm going to grab this camera, squeeze the tripod together so I can get through here. And you should be able to see that pretty well. This was cleaned a week ago. And at the very bottom here, you can see where I didn't quite reach down and get all the way to the bottom. But I got all the majority of it up here with that scrubber, and I loved it. So that was super awesome because I could hold the thing in my hand and I could just work my way around and chisel off all this stuff that grows on here because I really like the black background. Now when you compare the black background, well, you can't see it on this tank because the tank's in blue mode, but all that coralline back there actually does not look pretty to me. I would like that to be all black so all these anemones pop against it. So that is my personal opinion, my personal preference. I know everyone's got a preference. Let me get you guys reset up again. And we'll, whoops, sorry. That looks pretty good. All right, Spock says hi back. Okay, that was that. If you're wondering what those magnets were, there's the hammerhead, there's the piranha, and then there's the tiger shark. And these are very expensive magnets. This one here, I think that says $95. A lot of money. That's these big magnets I use in this tank. The smaller hammerhead I use on my 60-gallon. I've also used the piranha. There's even the shrimp, which is a little tiny one, but the shrimp doesn't float. Also, one of the things you can do with your cleaning magnet between the glass and the magnet itself, or the acrylic specifically in the magnet, is to use this little white scrubby. So I wanted to show you guys this really quick, and then we'll get into our topic. This is the latest incarnation of the tray that I built, the workstation. Now it has legs on the bottom, so when you set it down, your frags stay in place. There's room for frag plugs in here, which is kind of nice. And if you're looking for something like this, it's coming out on my website for $60. You can span your tank with whatever size PVC you need to set it on top and work from above your tank. All right. And then at the end of this, we're going to parameters. But let's talk about LPS corals. So what I want to do is take the camera, and I want to point you guys at the LPS corals specifically. And hopefully YouTube will give us a nice clean rendition. And I'm going to point out a few things for you first of all. So this right here is a frog spawn coral. This right here is a hammer coral. That giant thing back there is my anemone. Down here, a little lower, we've got a Duncan coral right here, another species of Duncan coral right here, pagoda cup. These are all LPS corals. And then on the very bottom here, on the bottom right, left here, this is a fungia that's oversized like She-Hulk. It's just, you know, not a pretty fungia. And then over here, You can see a fungia that looks relatively normal. There's Spock. Hi. And then over here are some pink hammer corals, also LPS. The fungia is an LPS. There's another hammer. This is actually a polyp that fell down, landed in the rockwork, and lived. And it is all fluffed up and happy. It's been growing there for about a year. And then this right here is a chalice, which actually technically is in the LPS family as well. So that's just a few LPSs when you look at the end of my tank. And I'm just going to leave this right there while I talk to you guys. An LPS coral is a stony coral that has a hard skeleton and very large polyps. LPS stands for large polyp stony. Now, you'll notice in my tank, my LPS are not moving very much. And I had people ask me specifically, well, how do you make them really open up? How do you, mine are all tight and compressed in my tank. And it could be that you have too much flow in the tank and on the coral itself. Not too much flow in the tank, but too much on the coral. So I would suggest if you have LPS corals and they're not happy, get them all the way down to the substrate and see how they look down there. Because they don't need as much light as SPS corals, and they don't need as much flow as SPS corals. SPS stands for small polyp stony. These are LPS, large polyp stony. Now, when you're putting them in the tank, they're very easy to place because they have a really large skeletal base. And so you can pretty much, like down here, I'm going to turn you guys again. These are all little frags that broke off, and I just have them sitting here because I've been a neglectful person. And you can see there's a hard piece right there that you could literally just stab into the sand and it would stand up. And I think what I'm going to be doing is taking several of these and glue them together into a little bouquet and then stand them up. And I think they'll be pretty and they'll grow. I've actually had this particular species for at least 12 years from the original frag I got a long, long time ago. And in the meantime, I've grown tons of them. I had something the size of a volleyball. Then my tank leaked and it broke into a million pieces, and I gave a lot of pieces away to people. And I've got some in here, and the anemone killed a bunch, but I've still got, you know, a few here, and there's a few in the front of the tank that are trying to grow. But you can handle the coral by the skeletal mass. You don't want to handle it by the actual polyp because you could damage it. You could crush it, and you want to avoid hurting the actual living polyp tissue. If you look very closely at an LPS coral, you will see babies down low. I wish I could zoom in, but I'm not able to with live streams. But if you'll look very, very closely at your hammer coral or your torch coral or your frog spawn, you might see tiny baby buds happening out on the sides of the skeleton, and those will become future heads if nothing messes with them, including you. So if you can avoid touching it and just let the coral grow, you'll end up with multiple polyps. Now, one thing that I think you'll appreciate, and one of those things that you probably don't see very often, I'm going to back this up a little bit here. I guess I need to duck down. Camera's lower. All right, so let's see where I'm at here. One of the things that you want to see, I got to look like I'm a dwarf. Get it? Dwarf? All right, let me move this up. It's driving me crazy. All right. And we'll move this over a little bit here so it doesn't bring any extra light in. Okay. Sometimes you'll see your LPS coral will have a huge bubble. And that bubble is a good thing. And people often say, what is that? Why is my coral doing that? It never did it before. I'm worried. Typically, when a polyp becomes a bubble, what's happening is inside it is actually splitting into two polyps. And when that bubble pops, it is basically the point where it has become two separate entities. It is its own way of propagating, not fragging. It doesn't frag itself, but it is actually making two heads. So if you see a bubble in your tank, that's always good. An LPS coral can also drop a frag, and you'll see a piece of tissue hanging down, and then it hangs down longer and longer until it's a really thin string, and then finally it just drops. And that is a type of self-fragging, and the coral actually dropped a little piece of itself somewhere else to grow. That's also totally normal. You don't have to touch it. You don't have to rip it off. You can just let it be and let it turn into whatever it's going to turn into. Ideally, you don't want to land in another coral. You want it to be in a spot where it's, you know, on top of rock, on the sand, just not in the middle of a clam or some other species down below that could sting it or consume it. Let's talk about water parameters, because we've talked about putting it down low. And we've talked about not hammering it with flow. LPS corals don't need a lot of flow, but they need some movement. In this tank right here, my flow is going that direction from these return nozzles, and it's coming from the far end 7 feet away, and the water is flowing this direction. And I was looking at this end of the tank, and there was no movement at all, which surprised me, because I thought with water going this way and water going that way, I'd get my movement, but it wasn't. So I ended up putting a MP40 on that side of the tank, and it points forward, and that was enough to create some flow through here. And my MP40 is set on a schedule that varies throughout the day. I pretty much love reef crest, which is where it spikes up and comes down and goes down to lagoon mode, and it's doing that throughout the day. And right now that pump is running at about 50%, and in a second it'll be at 25%, then it'll be at 55%, then it'll be at 60%, then it'll be at 50%, and that's what it does. And so you'll see kind of the changes. But there's enough flow that this coral always leans this direction. And this is not an LPS, this is a Gorgonian. The LPS corals, though, you can see there is some movement, and you can see there's not a problem because they're growing and they're thriving. They're not retracted, they're not being blown, the skin off the skeleton. That's what you want to avoid. So try to find that sweet spot. Now, let's talk about water parameters, because everything is about stability in your tank. And when things are off on your tank, your corals are the first to respond. And you can have certain corals in your tank to give you indicators. Like, for example, I really love pulsing zinnia. I think it's a beautiful coral, but I don't have any in my tank. But the reason I liked it so much, especially when it's a little tiny frag, not when it's spread everywhere, but when you have a little bit of it, it pulses and it's happy and it's just pretty. It's like a daisy that moves. And I really enjoy that coral, because if it's not moving, if it suddenly looks retracted, I can tell from across the room something's not right with the water in my tank. And that was one of those corals I used in the early part of the hobby. So if you're new and you're thinking about putting something in your tank, you could get Pom-Pom Zinnia. There's a different type of zinnia that is called what is the other one called? My brain is saying long tentacle, but that's not right. Anyway, if you wanted to try a beginner coral, Pom-Pom Zinnia is the one to get. And that's, you ask for pom-pom. It actually looks like pom-poms, like a cheerleader would be waving at a sport event. So that is the one I like. It's white, maybe a hint of pink, and they pulse, and it's pretty. And control it. Don't let it get everywhere. Don't let it grow on the glass. Don't let it spread to other rocks. It always grows upward. So if you put it down low, it's going to grow up to get to the light. It's going to constantly work its way up rocks. And as it works its way up, it's going to leave meat behind, and you have a polyp here, and a polyp here, and a polyp here, and a polyp here, and it works its way up the tank. So maybe put some at the top, because it has nowhere to go but across. That's my thought. I know that's not an LPS, that's a softie, but it's a really good indicator coral, and I just wanted to talk to you about that. But if your tank is stable, your corals will be happy. If you're constantly changing in fluctuation, and I mean, there are very specific things that hobbyists do and don't do. For example, do you test your water every single week? Do you test your water every single week, or are you just taking it to the fish store and having them test? Do you know what your parameters are? And do you know the exact numbers? Or are they terms like good, okay, bad? These are not numbers that we can work with. If you say, hey, I need help with my tank and everything's fine, well, that's not true. If everything is fine, you wouldn't even ask for help with your tank. So we need to know exactly your parameters, and we want to know alkalinity, we want to know salinity, we want to know calcium, we want to know magnesium, we want to know temperature. These are all things we got to know. And then, of course, there's other things like nitrate and phosphate, which you always ask about, especially in tanks that have algae problems. Now, can algae affect an LPS coral? It can, to some degree. If it grows on the coral and it encrusts against the tissue and the tissue starts receding and the algae keeps growing, that's a problem. But if you have a good cleanup crew in your tank, they'll always be picking that algae off and keeping your corals nice and clean. And then certain fish are workhorses. Like, for example, I have a coal tang in this fish tank that goes around and snacks on anything you can find that's algae related. Emerald crabs like to work on bubble algae. Some tangs may snack on turf algae, but it's not a guarantee, so I wouldn't count on it. A foxface could do a good job with algae control, but the foxface has spines on its back that could stab you, and it feels like a bee sting, and that's why I've never owned one, because I want to be able to reach my tank and not worry about anything hurting me. Speaking of things that hurt me, an urchin is another good one that can eat algae in your tank, but you could get stabbed. And I used to have what's called a diadema urchin, and they're known to eat hair algae, and they're a black ball with long needles that come off, and they would always stab me in the knuckle, and it hurt so bad. So if you have an urchin, watch where it is, where you're working. Maybe relocate the urchin temporarily so you can work on that spot, or just avoid that spot until the urchin has moved away, and then you can go do what you got to do. But keeping algae off your LPS is important. And remember that pink hammer coral I showed you guys, what, 10 minutes ago? I had a weird situation where that entire coral was closed up tight, but everything else in the tank looked completely normal. And I could not figure out what was wrong because the water parameters were coming back completely normal and all the livestock was acting normal except for that colony. So I had this crazy theory and I decided to try it out. And I treated my tank for cyanobacteria. I thought maybe cyanobacteria is living inside the polyps and it's affecting the tank. So I treated the tank, and just in case you don't know how I treat, I do not follow the instructions the way they're written. Typically, I disagree with them. But what I recommend you do is turn off your skimmer and turn off your carbon. And that way, there's no filtration to take the chemical out of the water. Put the chemical in your tank, ChemiClean or Red Cyano RX. As far as I know, they're the same thing. So either product you can get your hands on, those two products. Let the tank simmer for 3 days, 72 hours. At 72 hours, if you don't see any cyano in your tank anymore, do a big water change, which should be like 25% of your tank. Turn on your skimmer, run fresh carbon, and you're good. If you still see cyano in your tank, I really should do a separate video about this one more time, but anyway. If you still see cyano after 72 hours, put more of the chemical in the tank, basically treat again, but don't change anything. Skimmer is still off, carbon is still off, no water change. Just add more chemical to the tank and let it work for 2 more days. And at that point, you won't see any in your tank. Now you can do your big 25% water change, turn on the skimmer, turn on the carbon, and your tank will be great. Now, back to the LPS coral. That coral that was all shrunk down and unhappy after my treating the tank to kill cyanobacteria completely opened up. And I was like, wow, I can't believe it. It actually did it. In case you're wondering why that light turned off, it just switched from 10K mode to 20K mode. So you're going to see that light come on here in a minute or so, and the tank's going to be a lot bluer. Now, so that is a theory of mine, and I have never had anyone mimic that plan of mine, but it was my solution to helping an LPS coral that was obviously in distress. So if you are looking at all your corals and they're all normal, and yet you have this one coral that seems to be shut down, and you even have the impression you might have a cyanobacteria situation happening, maybe around the polyps, or you see it on the sand, maybe treating the tank will help your LPS coral get better. I do not feed my corals specifically. Like, I don't actually put food on them, but I used to. And so if you would like to feed your LPS corals, you absolutely can. There's 3 things you got to do. You got to turn off the pumps. You got to set a timer to remind yourself to turn the pumps back on. And then you need a turkey baster with your food so you can baste it into each coral. And the reason you turn off all the flow is because LPS corals aren't sticky. They can't grab food. They're not just going to like pull it in like an anemone will. So you can squirt the food toward it, and there's lots of choices. There's powdered foods that you can get wet first, stir it up in a cup of water, tank water, and let it completely become like a soup. You could use a frozen food that you completely thawed. Like, I loved using Cyclopes. That was a brand I used to buy. You can use mini mysis. You could use fish eggs. A lot of things you can use. And then you would squirt it toward the coral and sit back and wait 5-10 minutes. And you'll see the coral's mouth will just widen open, and it basically is inhaling the food. Now, the problem with this very slow motion feeding system is that if you have shrimp in the tank, like skunk shrimp, peppermint shrimp, the skunk is the cleaner shrimp, blood shrimp, starfish, they are all opportunistic and they'll come steal the food. And if you have fish swimming around, they'll steal the food. They'll go gobble up as much of it as they can. So you may need to put in quite a bit of food in your tank to hit these corals and give the chance for the corals to inhale some of that food and close their mouths around it. When I was feeding my LPS corals, I preferred to do it after lights out. And that worked for a while till my fish figured out what I was up to. So tanks completely pitch dark, and then I would turn off the pumps like 30 minutes later, so it's dark. The fish have all gone to their spots to sleep. And I would either use a flashlight or I'd flip on like the moonlighting and I would feed the LPS corals. But then after a while, my fish figured out what was going on. I was feeding sun corals, which is a beautiful LPS coral, and I was feeding other LPS like hammers, and the fish all came over to find food sitting in one spot. It was like a gourmet meal waiting. They didn't even chase it. They just swam up and ate it all. So if you're going to feed your LPS corals, try feeding them after dark. Try to do it when the fish aren't there to steal. And then I would also suggest you only do it once or maybe twice a week. This is not a daily thing. Now, Tubastria, or the sun coral, needs to be fed all the time. And so that coral, if you're trying to feed it once or twice a week, may not live. That one needs to be fed daily because it does not benefit anything from lighting. They live in total darkness in the ocean. And they're in caves and they're beautiful. And they love to be in the openings of caves where the water is flowing in and out constantly. And as that water rushes in and out, they're capturing particulates all the time and consuming it. But in our reef tanks, our tanks are pretty clean, and so we find that the coral does not get nearly enough nutrients, so you have to target feed it. Now, if you're worried about, oh, well, I can't feed that much to my tank because then I'll create algae and I'll create all these other issues, you can remove that coral gently from your tank to feed it outside the tank once a day. And it will learn what you're doing. So you wait for the coral to open up. You take a bowl and you put it down in the tank to scoop some water out, and you take the coral carefully as best you can from underneath and set it in the bowl, and then you can feed it in the bowl, and then like 5 minutes later feed it again, and 5 minutes later feed it again. Use a timer. Use a timer. I can't emphasize that enough because we so easily get distracted. You're going to put food on this thing, and it's going to be like watching grass grow. It's not going to be like, oh, I'm eating the food. It's amazing. It's going to be much, much slower. And so we get, oh, let me answer the phone, let me check an email, let me play a game, let me see what's on TV. And then you look and there's that bowl that's been sitting out your tank for an hour and a half and the water's cooled off and the coral looks unhappy. Set timers to remind yourself what you're doing so you can come back and hit it again with some more food and then hit it again and then lower it back in the tank and put it back inside your system. But by doing it in the bowl, you can limit how much of that extra food gets into your system because you can basically remove the coral from the bowl, dump the bowl in the sink. And that will keep the algae controlled. I did want to also mention top off being super important on tanks. And when I had my 29-gallon tank originally, I wouldn't top it off daily because it wasn't automated. And so the best rule of thumb would be for you to top off every single day when you feed the tank. So if you do that, your water level is always the same height. If you're just waiting for the water to drop and drop, and you're like, okay, let me refill it back up to here again, what's happening is as the water drops, the water's evaporating out of the tank, the salinity is rising. And as the salinity rises, it affects your corals. So we don't want the LPS to shut down because now the tank is 1.028, 1.029, 1.030. We want to keep the same salinity all the time. And typically my tank is always 1.026. So that is, I tested today, and I tested last week, I tested the week before, it's 1.026. And that's because I have a top-off system that is constantly adding water multiple times a day as it evaporates. All right. Now, I'm sorry I'm totally ignoring the chat because I want to focus on the topic. I want to talk about brown jelly disease because it's a really important one that we encounter as LPS owners. And this is going to be one of those things that happens a lot with hammer corals, sometimes with frog spawn, definitely can happen with torch, and those wall hammers, which, like I said hammer, but there's the branching type and there's the wall. A wall is like a solid piece and the hammer's all along the top. These corals, typically if they don't get enough flow, they develop something called brown jelly disease. And it kind of just sounds, it looks like what it sounds. It's a brown jelly. And it just smothers the coral and leaves behind a trail of death. And so if you see this weird brown stuff on the side of your LPS coral, it's very important that you siphon it out of the tank and don't let it go anywhere else. If you like turkey baste it to blow it into the water and it lands on other things, it's going to kill other things. Stuff is bad. So siphon it out or turkey baste it out or gently lift the coral out in a bowl and get it out of your system. And then you can put it in a bucket and you can rinse it off with a turkey baster and blow it all off in that bucket. You can then take the coral out and you can soak it in a solution of Revive from Two Little Fishies. I have it right here. This is Revive, and this is a coral dip, and it's a coral cleaner, and I think it's $8. And I think you need like 2 or 3 capfuls to a gallon of water. So you would just take a gallon of your tank water, put in some capfuls of this stuff, stir it around, put the coral in there for about 10 minutes or so. Turkey basted gently because it's an LPS coral, and then you can remove the coral carefully and put it back in your tank. You don't have to like rinse it and then put it in your tank. It'll be fine. This stuff smells like pine sol, but it says on the bottle, don't clean floors with it. I do sell this on my website if you need it. All right. Yeah, brown jelly disease is not something you want to mess around with, and you don't want to spread into your system. So siphon it out. And when I say siphon, any kind of tubing you own, put a bucket in front of your tank and just start siphoning it out, just like you're doing a water change, but you're targeting the slime. But you want all of it out. You don't want to leave any behind because you don't want to spread. Now, what causes brown jelly disease could be low flow, I mean, just not enough, and it definitely could be a huge alkalinity swing. Alkalinity is one of those really important elements that we measure a lot. And I do it throughout the week. I think about it and I check because I want to make sure I'm good. And you know, there's companies right now that have developed automatic alkalinity testers that will check your tank daily or multiple times a day. People are excited about the Trident coming out from Apex, which is supposed to measure your tank like 4 times a day and then give you a report. Alkatronics came out with a device that will measure your tank as frequently as you want. I mean, there's quite a few. And these machines are hooked up to your tank and drawing water right out of your tank, measuring on the spot, and then dumping into a waste container. And you open your phone and you can see your parameters. Super great for the guy that wants to be on top of his tank. It's a hint of laziness, but it costs so much that really you weren't that lazy. You spent a fortune to buy it. But knowing what your alkalinity is on your tank is key to keeping them happy. Now, I have to go from that point to tell you what I tell you all the time. My reef lives in spite of me. And it's really true because I've had a couple of times where my alkalinity shot way up because I was not measuring water. And I finally would get out the test kit thinking, yeah, I really need to do it. I haven't done it in weeks. And I measured my tank and it's crazy high. And you're thinking, how high could it be? 22 DKH, okay? That's really high. The target is somewhere between 8 and 11. And I'm at 22. And I stand back and I look at my reef. And I'm looking at the LPS corals and they're not contracted. I'm looking at, you know, the fish, they're swimming right side up. I'm looking at the anemone and it looks totally normal. And I'm thinking, how is it possible that my water's that high in alkalinity? So I will go ahead and I'll, you know, test again. And I'll test it a third time. And 3 tests in a row, I'm like, all right, fair enough, it's high. And I'll make the adjustment and make the correction. Now, if you have any kind of parameter in your tank that goes out of whack, and this is for all of you that send me those private messages on, I hear this all the time. You're like, okay, my calcium's way too high, what do I do? What you do is you stop adding calcium to your tank, period. You just stop. If you're dosing 2 or 3 part, which would be alkalinity, calcium, magnesium, and one of those parameters is high, stop dosing that one, keep dosing the others to keep maintaining them, and then when the number is finally where it needs to be, resume and go back to dosing all 3. And it's not, you know, normally we would say you have to dose part A and part B or part 1 and part 2. It's a daily thing, yes. But we have really learned to tweak our numbers because, you know, 15 years ago, you would put in exactly the same amount of both parts. So alkalinity was part A, calcium was part B. And you would, you know, like on a small tank, my 29 gallon, I'd put in 15 milliliters of part A and 15 milliliters of part B, and that was it. I did it every single day. And it seemed to match equilibrium perfectly. But we have exceeded what we did 15 years ago. And we keep, you know, I mean, I don't know. It's interesting. I guess we just have better gear. But now at this point, we might use 10 milliliters of alkalinity, 30 of calcium, 18 of magnesium. You know, that's not equal parts. Those are totally different numbers. But as long as you can maintain your solid numbers all the time, where you've got alkalinity always 9, it's always 9, it's always 9, perfect. That's how much you have to dose. You dose enough to stay at 9. If you go up to 9.5 or you go down to 8.5, that's okay. But stay as close to that target of that parameter with the right amount of dose. And then let's say your calcium doser goes crazy and just adds a whole bunch. Or let's say you're trying out some new product. There was a calcium product from Seachem. They had 2 different bottles, and I used the first bottle and I used it to, you know, treat my tank or dose my tank with calcium, and it worked great. Then the other bottle, I didn't really understand what it was, but it was a different type of calcium. And I don't mean like chloride versus calcium chloride versus calcium sulfate. It was some kind of thing that bonded with the amino acids, and it was like super, I guess I could say dense. And so when I put in pretty much the exact same amount, my entire tank, all my LPS corals closed down. And I contacted CChem. I said, why did that happen? I don't understand. I read the instructions. I think I did. Someone said, Mark, I did the exact same thing to my tank last week. And he said, I know exactly what you're looking at. My corals were all shut down super tight. And it's because this one has these amino acids, and it's like links in a chain, and you just hit them with so much at once. And I was like, oh, what do I do? And he said, stop putting anything in the tank. You could do a big water change, and that's the solution for any time your water gets really out of whack. If your numbers get hideous, and you're like, oh, my calcium's 500, when it has to be between 375 and 425. Those are your numbers. If you're up at 500, 550, 600, it's much too high in the water, and it needs to come down. The only thing that can take it down is going to be things absorbing calcium or doing a big water change to get it out of the tank. And the other thing you need to know is, does the new saltwater you mixed up, does it have normal calcium, or is it a really high calcium in the new batch? So you want to know, you're testing your tank, now test your newly made saltwater and see what the parameters are in there. I actually recommend that anytime you open a new box, a bucket, a barrel of salt, whatever you open for the first time, mix it up and do a test and verify. So to clarify, if you bought a bucket of salt and you open the lid for the first time, you mix up your salt water, you measure it, and now you know what the parameters are of the bucket, and you don't do anything else after that. You just do your water changes because you know what the numbers are. You don't have to do a test every single time you make a new batch because the whole bucket is the same. But, there's a caveat to that, because there's going to be people that are going to debate this in the chat later on, that when the buckets of salt are being delivered, that they shake in the trucks and that they sift and they settle out. And so one of the tricks to overcome this is to actually take your brand new bucket of salt and roll it around on the ground, or stir it up with a stick or something the first time you're using it, to make sure all the different elements inside the salt are mixed. And it's not like alkaline at the top, salt in the middle, magnesium at the bottom, or whatever is in salt mix, because I have no idea what's in that stuff. But typically, anytime I open a new batch of something, like when I buy the big barrel of salt from CChem, the Aqua Vitro, yeah, that's what it's called, salinity, I just mix up a batch and I measure it, and then I'm done. I don't measure the rest of the barrel. I know that I've tested it and it didn't have anything weird going on. If I buy a box of salt and it has a few bags in there, I'll measure the first bag, and after that I just use the box. So that way you know that when you're putting in new salt water, you're putting in all the right amounts and it's not causing more chaos in your tank. If you were mixing up salt water and your calcium's already high, and every time you put in new salt water and it raises higher and higher, you know that the salt mix has a problem, which you should have known by testing it in the first place. If there's a lack of alkalinity, every time you do a water change, your alkalinity comes down lower and lower and lower on the tank. That would be a problem as well. We don't want that. So I want to recommend you guys measure your new salt water. And if you're buying salt water at the fish store, then you probably are buying multiple jugs. Measure one jug, because it's all of the same batch, and make sure it's good before you pour it in your tank. Now, let's say your parameters are really high and you want to get them down, and I talked about changing water. You may need to change a lot of water. For example, on my tank, if my my alkalinity was crazy high at 22, what I ended up doing was I stopped the flow of calcium alkalinity being added to the tank for about 4 days. And that got it down to about 16 DKH. And at that point, I resumed the dosing and kept it at 16 for a few weeks. And then I shut it off for a few days and I let it come down to 12. And then I resumed the dosing and kept it at 12 for about a month, month and a half. And then finally I shut it off and I brought it down to 10, and that was it. And by bringing it down gradually over a period of basically 2 to 3 months, my corals never skipped a beat. I didn't have just death going across my tank. So you definitely want to stay on top of making changes so you're not swiftly changing it because you're in a panic. You don't want, if the livestock is acting normally but your numbers are just wrong, then gradually bring them back to where they belong. If your corals are in massive distress, it's a huge disaster, and you have good mixed salt water that you've tested and everything's great about it, change as much as you want. You could change 50, 60, 70% of your water. You could change 50% today, and then change 50% again tomorrow, and then 50% the day after that. That's not going to hurt your livestock as long as your pH, your temperature, and your salinity match. If you can get those three to match, you can change as much as you like. And that will quickly get all those numbers back into balance, because it was an imbalance, and that's what was causing chaos. So by correcting it that way, it's just a lot of work. And if you're not set up to have big batches, like let's say you have a 120-gallon tank, and I'm saying change 50 gallons at a time. Well, typical trash can is 33 gallons. So you've got to have a couple of trash cans of salt gallon water change. And 50 gallons isn't even half of a 120-gallon reef. So you see, you know, that was like a 40% change. And then you got to refill those, and it takes a day to fill those up. And then you got to mix them with salt, and then you got to do another water change. And you're going to feel like you're doing all these water changes, but you are getting it back on track. Now, how did it go out of track? Were you just pouring things in without thinking? Did you have a doser that went crazy? Did something siphon and drain all the liquid into your tank at once? You know, these are the things we have to investigate. What raised it up so high in the first place? So I hope that that helps you a little bit with figuring out how to get your water parameters stable, because if you can keep your stability, your livestock will put up with everything. And that's pretty much what I try to do with my tank. All right, what I'm going to do later is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read all these comments in here, you know, in the chat window, because I've not seen any of it. And then in the actual conversation underneath, I guess. Or maybe I'll do a follow-up video. Let's talk about water parameters for today, because it is Saturday. We're supposed to test our parameters. And I want to talk to you about my water parameters and talk to you about what's going on with my tank. And then I'm going to go ahead and just wrap this up. The first thing I checked was alkalinity, and it was 9.5, which is great. While I was traveling, my number, just before I traveled on that trip to Comic-Con, the tank had dipped down to around 7.5 or 6.5. It was really low, which was odd and didn't make a lot of sense. And you know, because I check every Saturday, but somehow it got away from me. So I dosed the tank with baked baking soda. Remember that video where I talked about making your own? And I buffered it up for a couple of days, and I refilled my calcium reactor with more media, and I made sure everything was running right, made sure there was no nothing clogged up. And when I left, my tank was 8.5. And my tank sitters, I had 2 different people watch because of a scheduling issue. They had to make sure that it was running smoothly the whole time, and measure my alkalinity once while I was gone for those 6 days. And everything was doing well. The sad part for me was that I did see a couple of spots in the corals where there was a couple of white spots, where a little bit of death had happened because the alkalinity had dropped, but it didn't progress. It stopped exactly at what I'd seen originally. When I came home from the trip, I was thinking, oh boy, you know, what's going to happen? And everything was great. So I'm really happy about that. We caught it in time, you know, I. So testing your water every Saturday is great to keep your reef alive. I'm recommending it. Salinity 1.026, I told you. Phosphate was 0.1. It's a little bit high. I'm getting film algae in my tank every day. I'm cleaning it with my magnets every day. Calcium was 400. Magnesium was 1300. I am dosing my tank with vodka. I've been doing it for the last 2.5 weeks to bring nitrates down. I tested nitrate. They're still off the chart, so I'm going to say 40, 50. And I just increased my vodka dosing to a higher number. And I'm hoping that I will, in about 4 weeks, I expect the nitrates to just drop. And that'll be great. So what I did was I borrowed the dosing pump from my magnesium, and I put it into a bottle of vodka. And I can show it to you. So we're going to go down here. And right there is the vodka bottle. It's going to a dosing pump, and it trickles right into the sump. And I'll show you the couple of spots that were white. So if you look in that edge of the Monty right there, you can see the little white spot right there. It's actually turning brown because it's dyed. But that was the only spot that actually got hit. And then there was a little spot of something else that turned white, but I don't see it at this point. And then, of course, the anemone is just busy killing my SPS. So, hey, I'm glad this wireless mic worked out well today. I'm wearing my Comic-Con shirt. Let's see. That look okay? Yeah. All right. already, go ahead and hit me with them now. I'm going to reply to a couple of you before I wrap this up. Rogue Aquariums, thank you for giving me $4.99. I actually turned that on because I saw these features. I added some products from Teespring to the bottom of my channel. So you're going to see things on there. Right now there's a few coffee mugs and shirts and hoodies. And I just did something really basic just to start it, just to turn it on in case some of you want something like that. And whatever you buy, obviously Teespring makes some money. I'll make a few bucks. I can feed some bucks. Oh, let me talk about that. See, I always have tank updates. By the way, this thing is crooked. It's driving me crazy. I want it to be straight. I'll do it like this. So, about last May, our club did a tank tour. And I'm watching for your questions. And on the tank tour, if you showed your tank, you got a gift certificate for the fish store. And I forgot all about it. So when they came, they gave me a $50 gift certificate for Frank's Tanks, which is the fish store right by my house. So yesterday I went up there and I bought a whole bunch of fish food and I used my gift certificate. And you know, like I said, I bought a whole bunch. I ended up spending $60.04. I only had to pay $10.04 because of my gift card. So that was a nice perk of opening my doors to the club so they could come see my tank, because now my fish get to be fed. I bought food, I bought some krill, I bought some mysis, and I bought some bloodworms. I use bloodworms every single day to keep my copper band fat and happy. I don't know where she is right now, but I always want to make sure she gets some worms inside her little beak so that she'll be happy. Someone asked, okay, Fishaholics is asking, what about walking dendros? Have you heard of a walking dendro? It's a really cool creature. It's a Lps coral that has a worm that is embedded in the base, and the worm will come out of the coral, grab onto the substrate, and pull the Lps coral to a new spot. And that's what makes the coral walk. And I've got a picture of it on my Critter ID page. It looks like a little Euphilia, like a little elegance coral. They're really pretty. They are awesome as long as they're getting fed. The coral has to be fed and the worm has to find food. So it's kind of a tandem situation. And I actually gave one to my friend Dwayne as a gift. It was hilarious. I was visiting him in Seattle, and I'm never going to let him live this down. That's why I'm talking about it on YouTube 6 months later. So we're at this event. He's letting me be a guest in his home. And at the frag swap, I see they have 5 or 6 walking dendros for sale. And I'm like, oh my God, that's awesome. I had one in the past. I'm going to buy one for Dwayne as a gift. So I walk up to Dwayne. I'm like, here's your present. And he's like, what is that? And his face is all like, oh no. And I said, it's a walking dendro. And he's like, I don't want that. And I'm just like, I just spent money to buy you this present. And I'm kind of just like playing it off. But I'm thinking inside, really? He really is mad at me for buying him a present? And he just assumed that this thing would kill everything in his tank, which is hilarious. Like it's a sea apple, like it's a grenade. It's a little tiny thing in a huge tank that's going to walk across the substrate. And it's awesome. And matter of fact, I need to ask Dwayne if he's murdered it yet. But no, he actually was happy later. He felt a little bit bad for his reaction, but his reaction was priceless. You buy someone a gift and like, I don't want that. I'm like, can you imagine that at Christmas time? So. The dendro is short for dendrophilia. So, but it really does look like an elegance coral. But dendrophilia are another beautiful Lps coral if you can get your hands on them. And I don't know if they're illegal to purchase in the US, like to import into the US. It just doesn't seem like we see them very often. So if you happen to come across one in a fish store, they're gorgeous. They're orange and they're open all day, where a sun coral is open all night. So if you can get a dendro, you can really enjoy it. And if you feed it on a regular basis, because it does need food to grow faster. And while it's going to feed off lighting, it does need food. And you can have yourself 2 or 3 polyps of dendrophilia. And they're big polyps. They're like the size of grapes. So they're really nice. Do you need sand for the walking dendro? Could it be bare bottom? Well, I'd like it to be sand. I think they need sand. And I think that because the worm is eating little tiny bits of detritus, and a bare bottom tank tends to be really clean, and you know your flow blows the detritus into the corners, and then you're siphoning it out. I don't know that it's going to find enough food to keep that worm fed, but you could give it a try and let me know what happens. Now, I wanted to see, I'm pretty sure I missed a question here from someone else. Okay, Tattoo Dancer asks if I could show flow in my tank. So we're gonna do that with this camera. And I know it's not gonna be high res, but we'll just do the best we can. Actually, I think I'm gonna take this off the tripod and we'll just freehand it. It'll be a lot easier for me. So let me get this. This is gonna be tricky. So if the focus is like I'm hoping it will, it's still kind of soft, but that is a Montipora that's encrusting, and it's got, you know, what, 5,000 polyps there, and then this is a Milka Coral, and you can see the polyps are moving, and yet it's really, I mean, there's a lot of flow, and you can see the polyps aren't moving all the same direction. The coral growth is kind of the same direction, but the polyps are like waving in pulses. So that kind of gives you an indication of flow. Now this light is just turning on, so it looks a little green right now. It's going to turn a little more yellow here in a second. It'll look a lot better in about 90 seconds. And you can see these LPS corals are moving in the flow a little bit. See that one on the top there, dead center on the frame? See how it's pulsing? I hope that's coming through okay for you guys. Just under that large acro in the dead center of the screen underneath it, that's my Walt Disney. Looks wrong, doesn't it? Because it's not being hit with blue light. But you can kind of see, I mean, I just don't know what quality you're getting from the live stream. I'm assuming this is 720p. This spot, the LPS is moving, and to be honest, it looks like it's being sucked toward this pump right here. But you see, it's between the two pumps. Yeah, it's green, but it's going to change. It's going to get cleaner in a second here. This is this light literally just turned on about 45 seconds ago, so it takes a minute to warm up. But here's another LPS down on the sand bed. This is an Echinata. My hand's shaking. Sorry. Let's see if I can stabilize this. All right, I'm just going to try and hold it here, and we're going to watch. And I think you'll see the skin move a little bit. See how it's moving a little bit? Give it a second. I'm trying to wait for it. I know, I'm freehanding. And I'm balancing it against the glass, but trying not to be too close. So, anyway, that coral does move. If you stare at it hard enough, you'll see the skin moving, like these pillows of flesh will kind of jiggle. And then this is a chalice that has zero movement unless the polyps are out. And there's the unknown acro that has been doing a beautiful job getting larger. I've got a lot of flow coming out of these flow accelerators, and they are blowing straight across the reef this direction. And these SPS are benefiting from all that flow. And then something else I want to do for you guys. I think we're just going to do it and see what happens. This might be the end of the stream. I'm going to hit my yellow button, and that will turn off my return pump. So now the return pump for these two nozzles is off. And I'm going to take off my light guard here. This is where we're going to lose it. You watch. I'm getting too close to the ballasts. And here's a view from above of the reef. And I turned off the return pump so you could see through the surface. Yeah. I really want to be careful not to get too close to these ballasts because I think it'll kill the Wi-Fi connection. But the reef is doing beautiful. This is the best view ever. And at this point, I just want to set up a reef tank on the floor that stands like 3.5, 4 feet tall, where I can just look down every single day. That's what I want. I don't even want a sump underneath anymore. Look at the size of that anemone. Well, if the tank sat flat on the floor and you had a window on the side, you could enjoy the reef while you're sitting on the floor. And then you could look down from above every single day and feed your reef. Maybe have your lighting on a system that goes up and down to kind of lift it up out of the way, or I don't know, throw a countertop on there when you have a party so no one throws their beer in your reef. But I mean, the tank's doing really well. Now, I want to talk about these hammers right here. I know my hand makes them look like they're really small by comparison, but this tank from here to there is 36 inches, and my hammer coral goes across the entire reef. That's about 24 inches across. And there used to be much more hammer, but this anemone right here killed a lot of it. And part of it just, it stung it, and then I had that big tiger cowrie that kept knocking the colony into the anemone, which then stung it and killed it. So I kept rescuing pieces. So I basically have created this wall of LPS right there. And then you can kind of see down below, there's a, well, can't really see it, but there's more Monty down there, and in the back are those pink hammers I showed you, and there's the frog spawn. So you're looking at only flow being moved in the tank right now from the Vortec pumps. And the return pump is off. So we've got 3 pumps moving water in a 400-gallon reef. 2 MP60s and an MP40. And it really is a nice view. I just love it. Okay. So that's that. That's there you're seeing yourself. All right. What else did I miss? No more questions. No more questions. I guess I'm off the clock. Guys, thank you so much for watching the live stream. And there should be one next week. And I think the week after that, there will not be, because I will be at Aquashella, which is in Chicago. And please test your water today. Post your parameters online. You know, if you're using social media, stick it on Facebook, stick it on Instagram, you know, stick it on the club forums, whatever it is you use to talk to others. Get everyone informed about your tank. Hold each other accountable. And if you post your stuff on Instagram, use hashtag post your results, hashtag water testing, and then do add Mila's Reef. Make sure your posts are public so we can see them. And I hope you guys have a great weekend. Bye, guys.